For centuries, ancient maps displayed a name that almost no one questions today: Tartary. Vast, silent, stretching across territories that we now call by other names. But what if the disappearance of this name wasn't just a cartographic update? What if there was a specific moment when something ended, not gradually but abruptly? Some fragments suggest a strange interval, a concentrated silence, as if, in just 36 hours, something had been ended forever. There is a curious pattern in the records of the 19th century, not in famous battles or widely documented treaties, but in the subtext: interrupted correspondence, diaries that end mid-sentence, administrative reports that mention atmospheric instability without ever explaining what that meant. In isolation, none of this is noteworthy, but when placed side by side, they form a sequence that seems compressed in time, as if multiple events had converged in an unusually short interval. The last 36 hours of what some call Tartary do not appear in any textbook. There is no official date marking the end. There is no proclamation. There is no formal surrender. What exists are absences. Between 1815 and 1820, European maps began to reduce the use of the term. In later editions, the name simply disappears. The accepted explanation is simple: geographical inaccuracy corrected with the advancement of knowledge. But this does not explain the speed, nor the silence. A set of letters preserved in a university archive mentions, almost casually, an unusual atmospheric event that would have affected vast regions of Eurasia. The description does not speak of war. It does not speak of invasion. It speaks of an obscured sky, of temperatures that dropped unexpectedly, of communications interrupted for days. In one of the accounts, there is a marginal note: if it continues for another 30 hours, nothing will remain as before. The sentence ends there. In fragmented meteorological records, the same period presents gaps, not incomplete data, a total absence of measurements, as if the instruments had stopped, or as if no one were there anymore to record them. The curious thing is that after this interruption, the reports return to normal, without explanation for the hiatus, without mention of what occurred during that specific interval. Later photographs show rebuilt cities, altered facades, partially buried structures that would later be attributed to urban reforms or grade reductions. The conventional narrative points to modernizations and isolated fires. But the chronological pattern suggests something else: multiple architectural interventions concentrated in a short period of time. Massive reforms that occurred almost simultaneously in regions separated by thousands of kilometers. Travelers' accounts also change tone. Before, they describe vast areas organized under a diffuse yet stable administration. Then they speak of territories that were reorganized, redistributed, reclassified. The language becomes bureaucratic. What was previously described as a broad cultural domain is now treated as a cartographic error. There is no gradual transition. There is terminological substitution. If there was a collapse, it doesn't resemble the ones we know. There is no record of marching armies. There are no treaties imposing new borders. What exists is a nominal erasure accompanied by administrative restructuring. And at the center of this hypothesis, a 36-hour interval mentioned repeatedly in marginal documents, as if something had reached an irreversible point during that specific period. A diary found in the 1920s, attributed to an imperial official whose name has been removed from the cover, describes the second day of darkness and the expectation that, at dawn, the orders would be different. It does not specify which orders. It does not mention who would issue them. It only states that continuity was suspended. The phrase is strange. Continuity of what? Governance, communication, lineage? The most intriguing thing is what happens next. Genealogical records of certain families associated with the regions formerly labeled as Tartary show gaps of 3 to 5 years, shortly after this supposed interval. Unregistered births, titles that cease to be mentioned, correspondence that begins to be filed under new territorial classifications. It is not the total absence that draws attention, but the silent reorganization. Maps printed before this period use the term naturally, Later maps treat the same territorial extension as a set of distinct entities, often newly named. The change does not occur over decades. It occurs almost from one edition to another. Cartographers rarely explain revisions of this magnitude without justification. Here, there is no detailed justification, only updating. And then there are the report's global climate events of that same year, often associated with the so-called year without a summer. The dominant scientific explanation points to significant volcanic activity, and it is plausible. But some private records speak not only of cold, but of something described as pressure in the air, constant vibration, silence of birds for 2 whole days. Subjective elements difficult to verify but repeated in distant regions. If the last 36 hours represented an extreme natural event, why was the subsequent administrative response so uniform? Why was the territorial nomenclature changed in such a coordinated way? And why did the term Tartary, present for centuries in European maps, disappear almost simultaneously after this period? There is no proclamation of end. There is no record of dissolution. There is only a before and an after, a set of documents that suggest an abrupt interruption, and a silence that extends to this day, where the name remains only as a historical curiosity, devoid of any structural connotation. Perhaps the last 36 hours were not the end of an empire, but the end of a designation. Perhaps they marked the transition between an old way of classifying the world and another more fragmented, more precise one, more aligned with emerging interests. Or perhaps they were just coincidence, a climatic phenomenon followed by inevitable administrative reforms. But when multiple independent records mention a specific interval, when maps change abruptly, when genealogies present synchronized gaps, coincidence begins to seem insufficient. And it is at this point that the question imposes itself, silent and persistent. What really happened during those 36 hours? If decisions were made, who made them? If there was destruction, what was lost? And if nothing extraordinary occurred, why do so many fragments seem to point to the same temporal void? Later photographs show apparent continuity. Governments functioning, active cities, established lineages. But the absence does not disappear. It remains in the archives, in the torn pages, in the revised maps without detailed explanation. A compressed interval in history. 36 hours that officially never existed, but that continue to echo in the margins of the record. There is a detail that is rarely mentioned when discussing the cartographic transition of the early 19th century. Most maps were not just geographical representations, they were political instruments. Whoever named delimited, whoever delimited, administered, and whoever administered, controlled. When the term Tartary disappears almost simultaneously in different printing centers, London, Paris, Vienna, we are not talking about an error corrected locally. We are talking about standardization. The records of the cartographic workshops show something unusual for that period. Urgent orders, concentrated revisions, accelerated reprints. Under normal circumstances, geographical updates took years to consolidate among different countries. The circulation of information was slow, dependent on diplomacy, trade, and expeditions. Still, the terminological substitution seems to have occurred in a matter of successive editions, as if there had been prior consensus. Correspondence between cartographers survives, but it is vague. They speak of alignment with the new territorial order. They do not specify which order. They do not detail which treaty. They only mention the need for standardization. The word appears repeatedly, to standardize what was previously vast, undefined, too broad. Meanwhile, administrative accounts of the regions formerly designated as Tartary begin to use more specific subdivisions. Local governors receive new cataloging instructions. Taxes begin to be recorded under different names. It is an intense bureaucratic reorganization, concentrated in a few years. Nothing that seems chaotic. On the contrary, everything is extremely methodical. But then personal testimonies emerge. A German merchant writes that the roads were strangely empty during a 2-day period in which the sky had taken on a metallic color. A missionary reports that entire communities remained secluded, awaiting guidance that never arrived. These accounts don't mention destruction. They speak of suspension, as if an invisible pause had been imposed on vast territorial expanses. If the last 36 hours were an extreme weather event, it would be reasonable to expect consistent scientific records. However, what we find are fragmented notes, observatories that interrupt measurements, diaries that describe anomalies without continuity. In some cases, instruments were recalibrated days later, as if something had temporarily compromised their functioning. There are also intriguing architectural records, administrative buildings that, after this period, undergo significant structural modifications. Not complete demolitions, but adaptations. Towers removed, inscriptions replaced, symbols scraped from facades. In certain cases, additional layers of masonry covering ornamental elements that do not fit the later style. These changes are not universal. They do not occur in all regions, but they are concentrated precisely in the areas previously labeled under the broad cartographic term. And curiously, many of these reforms are recorded as necessary modernizations without substantial technical detail. A similar pattern appears in military records. There is no declared war, but there are unusual logistical movements, troops deployed without recorded combat, stockpiles redistributed, outposts deactivated or reclassified. In internal reports, the expression preventive reorganization frequently appears. Preventive against what? There is no documented threat. There is no named enemy, just coordinated adjustments. Some historians argue that the disappearance of the term Tartary simply reflects the advancement of European geographical knowledge, which came to better understand the ethnic and political diversity of Central Asia and Siberia. This explanation is consistent and widely accepted. However, it does not address the temporal element. Why was the transition so concentrated? Why did the name replacement coincide with reports of atmospheric anomalies and documentary gaps? A set of customs records reveals that during that same period, trade routes were temporarily interrupted, not by military blockade but by adverse conditions. The expression is repeated in ports separated by thousands of kilometers. After 2 or 3 days, trade resumes, but with new territorial codes in the documents. In regional genealogies, some surnames associated with eastern territories begin to appear under new national designations. There is no recorded mass migration. There is no evident population displacement, only reclassification. It is as if the administrative identity had been updated en masse. There is also an almost imperceptible detail in the linguistic records. Before this period, the term Tartary appears in diplomatic correspondence as a functional reference. Afterward, it emerges only as a historical remnant, often accompanied by quotation marks or explanatory notes, as if it were something antiquated or inaccurate. This semantic shift is abrupt. It does not evolve gradually over decades. The vocabulary simply adjusts. If there was a natural event, such as a significant volcanic eruption responsible for global climate change, it could explain some of the atmospheric anomalies and the so-called year without a summer. Modern science offers robust evidence for this scenario. However, natural events do not rewrite maps on their own. They do not reorganize registry offices. They do not synchronize architectural reforms. The most cautious hypothesis is that multiple factors converged. A severe climatic phenomenon could have accelerated administrative processes already underway. It could have created an opportunity for political and territorial reforms. It could have served as a catalyst for strategic redefinitions. But the temporal concentration remains intriguing. 36 hours mentioned in the margins of diaries. 2 days of darkness described by travelers. Interruptions of records interrupted and resumed as if nothing had happened. In some regional archives, there is reference to extraordinary orders issued during that same period. The orders are not preserved, only mentions of their existence. They would have instructed local authorities to adapt records to the new conformity. New conformity to what? It is not specified. The absence of documentation does not prove intent. But when the absence is systematic and chronologically aligned, it becomes a fact in itself. And perhaps that is the central point of the last 36 hours. Not a spectacular cataclysm, not a hidden war, but a compressed transition window in which profound administrative decisions were made under the shadow of an extraordinary natural event. If so, Tartary did not end in flames. It ended in ink, in stamps, in typographical revisions, in new editions of maps that redefined the way the world would be described from then on. Still, the question that echoes in the fragmented records remains. Why do so many personal accounts describe that period as something more than just bad weather? Why is the language used one of suspension, of waiting, of expectation for orders that would change everything? Perhaps because for those who lived through that moment, the change was not merely terminological. It was structural, invisible to most, but decisive for those who understood the scope of the reorganization. The last 36 hours may not have been the end of a forgotten civilization, but they may have marked the end of a way of seeing the territory, vast, continuous, undefined, replaced by more rigid, more strategic borders, more aligned with the emerging interests of the European powers. And if that was the case, then the silence that followed was not imposed by destruction, but by normalization. Because nothing silences more profoundly than something that simply ceases to be mentioned.